Behind me is the lower Pioneer Valley of Springfield, nestled in its little nook along the Connecticut River, just on the other side of Proven Mountain. And you can see it right there. And it would be the lower Pioneer Valley that would witness the ravages of King Philip's War as September made its way to October. Springfield, Massachusetts, called the City of Homes, the third largest city in the state of Massachusetts, and I think the fifth largest in New England by population. A city with a storied history, but a city whose beginning is shrouded in mystery. William Pynchon, the original founder of the city, had come up the Connecticut River with an idea to establish peaceful relations with the river tribes. More than any other colony in southern New England, the Springfield colony attempted to maintain a good relationship with the native people. There are 37 court cases involving native people and the English here in Springfield where the native people won. There's not a single other case in southern New England where that can be said to have happened. So Springfield was cognizant of the fact that the native people were their key to the tributaries of the Connecticut, which provided them with the opportunity to extract furs from way up in the Berkshires to the west, or the Worcester Highlands to the east. The Westville River, the Chicopee River, the Millers River, the Deerfield River provided that access, and you needed to keep the native people happy. He signed a deed with the Agawam native people, who granted his colony permission to be established nearby. And he establishes the first church on this site. And around the church, in a series of long plots, the community was established. For more than 2 generations, the peoples of the Pioneer Valley lived side by side. They shared hardships, struggles, conducted trade, and existed as neighbors until whoever the native leader was that organized the attack, whether it was Muddawump, Matunis, Sagamore Sam, Monaco, or Philip himself, whoever the leader, had organized in and around the Agawam village and was preparing an attack for days prior to October 5th. A ruse involving attacks against Hadley to the north and Westfield would divert the trained bands guarding the city away, and the tribes gathered in the Agawam village would fall upon the city. Right back here, once upon a time, was the great Agawam stockade. The Agawam native people lived here for around 40 years after they had come across the river to the east side to join the Springfield settlement, located about 2 miles to our north up the river. This stockade that the native people lived in on its hill was a far better defensive location than the settlement picked by Pynchon for Springfield. Remember that when Pynchon established Springfield, he was looking to establish peaceful relations with the native people. Behind me is the statue of Toto, the savior of the Springfield colony, who on October 4th, 1675, told a gentleman that he was working for, not voluntarily really, he was sentenced to be a debt servant down in Windsor, Connecticut, for some unpaid bills. That was a typical English punishment for someone who hadn't paid their bills. Well, Toto was working down there. He'd take a canoe from his village, which is right on the other side of where his statue is. You can see that crown of pines back there. He'd take a canoe south to Windsor, Connecticut. He'd work for his master, and then he'd come back every day and sleep in the village with his wife and kids. Well, one day the master noticed that he appeared a little tired, and when asked about it, Toto said, "I can't sleep. Strange Indians are banging drums in my village. They've been staying there for a few days now. They give speeches, they bang drums. I can't get sleep. If Toto can't sleep, how can Toto work?" Well, the person that he was speaking to, an English gentleman from Windsor, quickly sent a horseman to Springfield. And they arrived there late in the night of the 4th, and they warned the city who quickly began to take shelter in the 3 garrison houses available to them. The gentlemen left behind as the train bands marched away, gentlemen who had served the community for years as selectmen, as constables, as sheriffs, Miller and Cooper, guarding octogenarians who were the founders of the community, men like Reverend Chapin and Elijah Holyoke. These men aren't afraid of the Agawam. Our native people love us. They've been our neighbors for years. Many of them are Christian. There's no way they would rise up against us. And they're going to be surprised by the events of the 5th of October. Cooper and Miller said, we'll ride up to the village site and we'll find out what's going on. Surely, this has got to be just a bad rumor. When they got here, and here, once upon a time, was a stream bed. That stream, you can kind of see it snaking down the hill there. There's a retaining wall, and it goes under the road right there and then down into the Connecticut River. When they got here, they rode right into an ambush, with both men being shot, Miller fatally. Cooper, shot through the chest, was able to turn his horse around and ride like the devil was behind him to the city about a mile away. Like a Paul Revere 100 years earlier. This is October of 1675, the dawn, the morning of the 5th. He'll ride to the city, and his last words as he falls dead from his horse will be, "The Agawam are upon us. The Agawam have risen." And he falls down in the dust at the feet of the settlers. All hell broke loose in the city. Minister Glover, who had been shamed earlier by the octogenarians for panicking the city by risking the lives of his servants and indenturees, forcing them to bring his books down from his fine home on the hill to one of the garrison houses, and then having been told by nature of atonement to bring the books back, meaning the indenturees and the servants got to bring the books back. Glover's books are scattered all over the city of Springfield in the ensuing panic. The natives, led by most likely Metacom. If you look at the plan and the way the plan was prosecuted, with the train bands being diverted away and the stealthy ambush on the south side of the community, you can really see Metacom's hand in the affair. This is really the great coup of the early part of King Philip's War. It was well planned out and well executed. For almost 5 hours, the city falls prey to native attacks that are unchecked, with no trained band to defend them. Young men, women, and the elderly of the community in the garrison houses. It's lucky that the disaster wasn't worse. But the natives satisfied themselves in an orgy of looting, pillaging, and burning. One of the women in the community hadn't gotten back to the garrison houses in time after the second warning, and she will be cut down and killed in view of the garrison. For such a climactic moment in a community's history, there really aren't a lot of surviving stories from the attack on the city of Springfield. We have one that needs to be addressed, though. A young Agawam warrior who was fairly well known in the community and was known for being a little bit lazy, and had been fined and had been punished and had been a debt servant for a time. And he'll break into the home of his most recent master and come out with a serving tray, a silver serving tray, that he will quickly strap to his chest. You know, it's got the handles on the sides, and he'll tie it to his chest as if it is a cuirass. And anyways, it's a breastplate. So he's got this breastplate strapped to them, but it's not really a breastplate, it's really a serving tray. And he runs up very close to one of the garrison houses with his weapon loaded and calmly aims and fires through the window, causing the defenders to have to duck, and they're amazed at his temerity. He stands there and basically dares them, and one of them fires a shot, and bang, the gong of the bullet bouncing off the serving tray strapped to his chest makes him burst out in giddy laughter and causes consternation in the defenders, who proceed to double load and double shot one of their pieces. And as he runs forward again, they will fire, and down he will go with the silver serving tray pierced neatly with a hole, and him on the ground to trouble no one anymore. Interestingly, that serving tray will remain part of the family that it belonged to up until the beginning of the 20th century, when purportedly an Irish serving girl who didn't know its history cleaned the cupboard that it was stored in and threw it out. The first of the trained bands to come up will be led by Major Treat. The problem that he has is he's coming from the west side and is going to have to cross the 350-yard wide Connecticut River with a native force on the bank in opposition. And he only has a few canoes and launches to carry his men. When one of his soldiers is struck in the neck, that attempted relief will pull back to the west side of the river, and the attack continues until Appleton and Pynchon, coming down from the north, allow for the crossing of the river, and the three bands will then move on Springfield. Pynchon wasn't a warrior, and he had asked multiple times to be relieved of command, and he had finally been granted that honor on the morning of the 4th, but had led his trained bands north to Hadley along with Appleton, I'm sure, to conference and to let Appleton know how he would have to deal with a very reluctant Connecticut alliance. And that's what we see with Treat. We see Treat take his sweet time crossing that river, not wanting to risk any of his soldiers until the two trained bands coming from the north arrive. And you can only imagine John Pynchon, who's done his very best to try to maintain the network of alliances with the various tribes, to keep peace on the frontier, to maintain the trading post and the various mills that he had set up, keep the communities flourishing. He had founded several towns himself. He had been responsible for the expansion of the river colony, and yet this war will tear him apart. John Appleton of Ipswich, Massachusetts, a stranger to the valley, will become commander of the unified forces of Connecticut and Massachusetts within the Connecticut River Valley, at a time when their morale is at the lowest, when every one of their communities has been attacked, and their major community, Springfield, lies in ruins. So on the evening of the 5th of October, the victorious native people, under Metacom and Philip's leadership, will celebrate their victory by burning 23 great council fires on the slopes of the steep hill at Indian Orchard, above the Chicopee River's meandering course. They'll celebrate by eating the slaughtered cattle, glutting themselves, successful in their endeavor to surprise and destroy the community. Their plan had worked perfectly. Now, we think today about the casualty figures, and it's been known when we study King Philip's War that the forces of the English traditionally underreported their losses. And I kind of believe that the idea that only 3 people fell defending the city is kind of a little bit light, considering the length and volume of the attack. The 23 fires burned above the city, as evidenced by other attacks, suggests that 23 victims fell to the native attack. Now, these victims might be easy to underreport, as they are not members of the Springfield community, but indentured servants, simple servants, or strangers, not members of the congregational community. It's hard to find out today, but I speculate that there were more losses than the 3 reported at the end of the engagement. The morning of the 6th was a day of reckoning for the Springfield settlement, with the surviving citizens leaving the garrison houses and looking at the ruins of what had been their fair village. With the trained bands of Treat out of Connecticut, Appleton, now in command of Springfield's trained band, and Samuel Mosley in the area, it was decided that Treat would move north and west, that Appleton would search the eastern edge of the region, and Mosley would proceed at all speed toward the village of the Agawam on Long Hill. When Mosley got there, he found that the village was abandoned, and the wigwams still stood with fires still smoking. In and amongst those wigwams, he found a squaw sachem who was known to the community. He questioned her at length using a variety of methods, and Mosley wasn't the nicest of colonial soldiers. He had begun using horror as a weapon relatively early in the war and had been ruthless to any neutral native people that he had found, whether they were connected to Philip and the Rising or not. In the case of his actions with the squaw sachem, he questioned her about whether or not Philip was among the hostiles. Who else were some of the leaders involved? Was it Muddawam, Matunis, Sagamore Sam, Monaco? And finally, how many warriors were on the warpath in the attack on Springfield? She gives reasonable answers to Mosley's queries, and it's from her answers to the questions that we've come to the conclusion that there were between 500 and 700 hostiles involved in the attack on Springfield. When he was done with his questioning, he turned his war dogs loose on the woman, and they proceeded to tear her to pieces. Mosley had begun using war dogs, mastiffs, large animals that had been bred as man-killers, bred to protect the manor houses of England. And he basically had been using them as guided missiles, hunting down hostile natives, and in his case, hostile or any native, in the hardwood swamps of New England. The woman's screams brought an end to the 6th of October. The following day, a council of war would decide on strategy. Pynchon had convinced Appleton that the way to survive in the valley wasn't marching around the countryside trying to find native war bands, but to maintain fortified and garrisoned villages. This, Appleton believed, also would be the key to their success, at least their surviving the winter. Major Treat of Connecticut, though, as was typical, wanted quick action. And as he had shown before, he wasn't going to bow to being second in command, and leaving a few of his men garrisoning Westfield, he would take the majority of his Mohicans and soldiers back across the border into Connecticut when he heard of a proposed attack on Wethersfield. This meant there were only a few bands in the northern part of the valley guarding the triple communities of Northampton, Hatfield, and Hadley. Hadley being the main base. And Hatfield ended up being a target for attack by the natives. Hatfield, Massachusetts would feel the fury of the native people's rising soon after Springfield was burned. It was critical to maintain the three cities in the central part of the Connecticut River Valley, and that would be Hatfield, Northampton, and Hadley. And Hadley became the main base of operations, as proposed by John Pynchon before he was relieved of command, and Appleton took that position. And Appleton began creating a stockade there that would be the anchor point to keep the train bands provisioned and the communities around safe, in the sense that the train bands would be able to sally forth out of Hadley to reach Hatfield here or Northampton just to our south. Now, on October 19th, two train bands were in the community of Hadley. Captain Poole and Samuel Mosley's gang were here when, to the north, maybe a mile and a half from where I am, a couple of fires were seen on a hillside. And it was determined that that's clearly got to be a band of natives, a band of savages preparing to attack. And so Mosley, who had you got to give him credit. He had learned a little bit by this point. He will dispatch 10 men toward the north. And as they move just about a mile and a half away from here, they walk right into an ambush. And in that ambush, 7 are killed outright, 3 are captured and tortured, with 1 escaping to get back to tell the tale. And when they got back here, the sounds of that ambush had carried and led to the ringing of the bell, which would bring from the south out of Hadley Appleton's train band. And he would be followed by Treat's train band out of Northampton. And before you knew it, there was a substantial force of 3 train bands here with 1 coming, when across the fields, 700 native people will fall on the stockade. The resistance inside the stockade was far greater than had been met by the native people in any previous encounter. Hatfield was prepared on that October afternoon, although men paid the price for that preparation. Freegrace Norton will be killed defending the position, and Major Appleton himself will end up with a ball going between his hat and his head, which tends to concentrate the mind wonderfully. The defense was able to hold back consistent and concentrated attacks with a few hard volleys, it is described, and ultimately the native people pulled back, deciding on a softer target. This would be the last of the great attacks that would occur in the valley in the fall of 1675. Had they not been able to hold this position, very well could have evacuated the valley. It's hard to say what the leaders in Mass Bay would have done. The Connecticut alliance was already suffering some cracks, with Treat disgusted at the way in which the war was being prosecuted. It very well could be that the Battle of Hatfield was the most important English victory of King Philip's War. Had they not won this battle, the devastation that the valley has suffered at the hands of Metacom and his confederated war chiefs could have led to its evacuation, which would have raised the prestige of the rebellion and brought in more tribes and more warriors to throw at the existing English colonies. Despite the victory, though, the majority of the valley was in shambles, with livestock slain, barns and communities in ashes. Both peoples would be looking into a coming winter where starvation would be an agonizing reality. Remember that for both peoples, war has a definitive season. For Europeans, that would be April to October, and for native people, it would be late spring and early summer. But in this case, this is a war that has become total, and it will continue to rage to the frosts and snow of the winter of 1675 and 76. Thanks for watching, and expect another as our frosts and snow begin to rage in the winter of 25-26.